Did the Vikings really wear horned helmets? And what secrets lie hidden beneath the icy waters of the North Sea? Join us as we unravel the myths and realities of these legendary seafaring warriors. Prepare to be transported to a world of fierce battles, majestic longships, and ancient sagas. This video brings the Vikings to life, revealing the true story behind these enigmatic warriors and traders. From the 8th to the 11th century, they ruled the North Atlantic, striking fear into kingdoms and carving their names into history. But beyond the blood and fire, the Vikings were more than raiders. They were explorers, builders, merchants, a people whose reach extended from the icy fjords of Scandinavia to the deserts of Arabia. Their world was one of danger and wonder, of sagas whispered by firelight, of gods and men whose destinies intertwined. Tonight, we open the sails to their story and step into the legend of the Vikings. It began in the frozen north. In the fjords of Norway, the forests of Denmark, and the rugged coastlines of Sweden, a people were forged in cold, hunger, and restless ambition. These were the Norsemen, men and women who refused to be contained by the limits of their harsh homeland. But their greatest weapon was not their axe, nor their sword. It was their ships. Carved from oak and ash, Viking longships were marvels of engineering, vessels that seemed alive, bending with the waves rather than breaking against them. With shallow keels, they slid effortlessly from the open sea into narrow rivers, giving the Norse an unmatched advantage. Few ships in history could strike a coast at dawn and vanish inland by nightfall. These ships were freedom. They were power. They were destiny. With them, the Vikings cast their gaze outward. They rowed westward, braving the unforgiving North Atlantic, pushing into lands thought unreachable. They found Iceland, Greenland, and even Vinland, a mysterious coast we now know as North America. They sailed south, cutting across the stormy waters to raid the British Isles and the coasts of Francia. But they did not stop there. Their journeys reached the glittering markets of Byzantium, the vast rivers of Russia, and as far as the Caspian Sea, where east met west in trade. Their reach was astonishing. Long before the so-called Age of Exploration, the Norse were already charting new worlds, guided not by compasses but by the stars, the sun, the wind, and the sea's hidden language. And yet, their voyages were not born only of ambition. They were born of necessity. The 8th and 9th centuries brought change to the north. The medieval warm period softened the brutal cold. For the first time, land once locked by ice opened for farming. Populations grew. Families swelled. Ambition burned hotter. For the Norse, survival demanded expansion. So they sailed, not as lost wanderers, but as calculated risk-takers who turned the sea into their road, their weapon, and their lifeline. And from the edges of Scandinavia, they redrew the map of the medieval world. Wherever they went, they carried more than steel. They carried stories, gods, language, trade, and fear. Their ships were not just vessels of wood, they were vessels of transformation. This was the birth of the Viking Age. An age of sails and storms, of daring voyages and restless ambition, when the Norse claimed the horizon itself. When most people hear the word Viking, they imagine fire and steel. They imagine raiders bursting from a morning mist, long ships gliding silently up rivers, and villages set ablaze in sudden fury. And in truth, the Vikings cultivated this very fear. Their warriors were not endless hordes of barbarians as medieval monks described them. They were carefully organized bands, bound by loyalty, skill, and ambition. Each carried weapons forged not only for war, but for identity. The sword was prestige, a weapon of kings and chieftains, often decorated with silver and runes. The axe, simple, brutal, and devastating, was the weapon of the common fighter. The spear, light and versatile, was perhaps the most common of all, allowing warriors to strike from a distance or in tight formations. And behind them, shields painted in bold colors formed protective walls that clashed against enemy lines. But among these warriors, some stood apart, the berserkers. Cloaked in wolf pelts or bear skins, these men were said to fight in a trance-like rage, howling, foaming at the mouth, and striking with superhuman strength. To face a berserker was to face a storm of fury. Ancient sagas tell us they felt no pain, that wounds did not slow them, that Odin himself had filled them with a divine madness. Some scholars believe it was ritual, others suspect hallucinogenic herbs, but in battle, legend and reality blurred. What mattered was the terror they inspired. The Viking art of war was not chaos, it was strategy. They struck where their enemies were weakest, monasteries left unguarded, coasts undefended, towns asleep at dawn. Their ships allowed lightning raids deep into the heart of kingdoms. By the time defenders mustered their forces, the Norse had vanished, richer, stronger, and emboldened. Yet they were more than raiders. On the battlefield, they fought with discipline. Shield walls crashed against shield walls, spears thrusting from behind the wooden barricades. At close quarters, axes split helms and shields alike. Their ability to adapt, to fight in tight infantry formations, to ambush from rivers, to retreat quickly to their ships, made them some of the most feared warriors in Europe. And their impact was undeniable. Across England, Francia, and beyond, entire political systems shifted under the threat of the Norse. Kings were forced to raise new armies, fortify towns, and pay heavy tributes, the infamous Danegeld, just to stave off Viking destruction. Even the mighty Frankish Empire bent under their blows, its rivers choked with dragon-headed ships. The Viking warrior was not merely a brute with a weapon. He was a tactician, a symbol, a force of nature. And wherever they fought, they carved themselves into the memory of Europe, not just as destroyers, but as architects of fear and change. To see the Vikings only as raiders is to miss half their story. For behind the axe and the shield lay another identity, one that reshaped the medieval world just as powerfully as their raids. The Vikings were not only warriors, they were traders. Their ships, so feared for the lightning raids they carried out, also became the lifelines of vast commercial networks. From the icy fjords of Scandinavia, the Norse spread across seas and rivers, connecting worlds that had long remained apart. With their longships, they bridged oceans and cultures, carrying not just steel and terror, but silver, silk, spices, and slaves. The Viking Age was as much about trade as it was about conquest. In bustling markets from Hedeby in Denmark to Birka in Sweden, Norse merchants dealt in goods from across the known world. Amber from the Baltic coast glittered in the stalls. Furs from the northern forests, prized for their warmth and rarity, were sold in abundance. Walrus ivory, carved from the Arctic, became a luxury in faraway courts. And everywhere, silver flowed. Silver coins from the Abbasid Caliphate, struck thousands of miles away in Baghdad, found their way into Viking hordes, proof of a global economy long before the modern age. Their routes stretched astonishing distances. Sailing down the rivers of Eastern Europe, they reached the great markets of Byzantium and the Caliphate. There, they traded furs and slaves for silk, wine, glassware, and precious metals. To the west, they carried goods into Ireland, Britain, and Francia, leaving behind towns that grew into thriving centers of commerce. Even the fabled Silk Road felt their influence, as Viking merchants carried Asian goods into Europe through their northern corridors. But this trade was not only about wealth, it was about transformation. Wherever the Vikings went, they left behind more than goods. They spread ideas, technologies, and cultural exchanges. They introduced new crafts and artistic designs. They adopted foreign luxuries and blended them with their own traditions, creating a hybrid culture that bridged east and west. And the impact was profound. European economies began to shift under the weight of Viking trade. Small settlements grew into market towns. Kingdoms grew richer or weaker, depending on their ability to control or withstand the Norse presence. Even Christianity itself found new inroads into Scandinavia, not first through conquest, but through commerce. The Vikings remind us that power does not only come from the sword. It comes from the marketplace, from the ability to connect worlds, to profit from exchange, to weave a network of influence as strong as any shield wall. They were feared as raiders. But in truth, they were also the merchant kings of the north, men who carried not just fire, but fortune across the seas. Beneath the clang of swords and the creak of longships lay the heart of the Viking world, a society bound together not only by power and trade, but by faith, honor, and myth. For the Vikings, life was a tapestry woven by the gods themselves. Every raid, every voyage, every harvest carried the weight of divine destiny. They believed their fates were spun by the Norns, the weavers of destiny, and even the greatest king could not escape the threads they laid. Odin, the All-Father, watched over warriors, poets, and kings alike. He was the seeker of wisdom, the god who sacrificed an eye for knowledge, and in his name, men raised their blades with courage. Thor, the Thunderer, wielded his mighty hammer Mjolnir, protector of both gods and men, a symbol of strength that many Vikings wore around their necks. Freya, goddess of beauty and war, was invoked by those who sought both love and victory. These were not distant gods. They lived in the sagas, in the thunder that cracked across the skies, in the storms that battered longships at sea. To the Vikings, the world was alive with spirits, both fierce and protective. Sacred groves, burial mounds, and carved wooden idols tied the living to their ancestors and to the divine. Society itself mirrored this belief in balance and fate. The Vikings lived in close-knit communities where honor and reputation carried more weight than gold. Families were the backbone of a clan, and every man and woman knew their role, from warriors and farmers to traders and storytellers. Women, unlike in many parts of medieval Europe, held a powerful place in Norse life. They could inherit property, manage estates, and even command respect as priestesses or shield maidens. At the heart of their society was the Thing, an assembly where free men gathered to make decisions, settle disputes, and enforce justice. Here, the Viking spirit of independence and community shone. No king ruled without the approval of the Thing. No man lived entirely outside its judgment. But always, behind the laws and the daily labors, loomed the ultimate truth, Ragnarok, the end of all things. The day when gods and giants would clash, when the world itself would burn, only to be reborn anew. For the Vikings, this was not despair. It was purpose. To live with honor, to face death without fear, to carve one's name into memory before the final twilight. This was the Viking way. And it is why, more than 1,000 years later, their stories still roar like thunder in our imaginations. They were not only conquerors of land and sea, they were builders of a world where myth, law, and life were one. The Vikings lived in a world where the divine and the mortal were never far apart. Every storm, every harvest, every birth was woven into the great saga of the gods. At the center of it all stood Yggdrasil, the great world tree. Its roots plunged into the underworld, its branches touched the heavens, and all realms of existence clung to its mighty frame. The gods themselves gathered beneath its shade, while dragons gnawed at its roots and eagles soared in its crown. Yggdrasil was more than a tree. It was life itself, the axis of the universe. In Asgard, the realm of the gods, dwelled Odin, the relentless seeker of wisdom. He plucked out his own eye at Mimir's well, trading sight for knowledge. He hung for 9 nights on Yggdrasil itself, pierced by his own spear, to seize the runes, the secrets of magic and power. His sacrifices shaped the Viking belief that wisdom came not from comfort, but from pain. By his side was Thor, hammer in hand, protector of Midgard, the world of men. When thunder rolled across the skies, the Vikings heard Thor's chariot wheels. Every strike of lightning was his hammer, Mjolnir, crashing down upon giants who sought to destroy order. Farmers prayed to him for good harvests, warriors for victory, sailors for safe voyages. But the gods were not only warriors. Freya, the goddess of love, beauty, and war, ruled half of the slain who fell in battle. She guided the fierce and the passionate alike, her tears said to turn into gold. Her brother, Frey, brought fertility to the land, ensuring crops, peace, and abundance. Yet in the shadows lurked Loki, trickster, shapeshifter, the betrayer. He was the one who brought both laughter and chaos, weaving mischief that sometimes saved the gods, but more often doomed them. Through Loki, the Vikings understood that life itself was unpredictable, that even the gods could not escape fate. And fate itself was merciless. The Norns, 3 mysterious women, sat at the base of Yggdrasil, spinning the threads of destiny. Kings, farmers, gods, all were subject to the threads they wove. No one could cut them, no one could escape them. The greatest of all destinies awaited in Valhalla, Odin's Hall of the Slain. Warriors who died bravely in battle were chosen by Valkyries, maidens of war, who carried them across the skies. In Valhalla, they feasted, fought, and trained endlessly, preparing for the final battle, Ragnarok. Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods. A prophecy of fire and ruin, when wolves would swallow the sun and moon, when Loki would break free from his chains, when giants would march against the gods, when Thor and Jormungandr, the world serpent, would kill each other in a clash of thunder and poison, when Odin himself would be devoured by Fenrir, the monstrous wolf. The world would burn, yet from the ashes, a new one would rise. Green, fertile, reborn. Humanity would live again. This was the heartbeat of Viking belief, that even in death, there was renewal. That courage, honor, and memory outlasted flesh and bone. And so every raid, every voyage, every battle cry was not just for glory, it was for eternity. The Viking Age may have ended 1,000 years ago, but spirit never faded. The Vikings left behind more than battle scars. They carved their mark into language, law, trade, and legend. They were skilled seafarers who braved uncharted waters and reached shores no European had seen before. They were fierce warriors whose courage and strategy reshaped kingdoms and terrified empires. And they were influential traders, weaving a vast network that tied together East and West, reshaping economies and cultures for centuries. Their myths still inspire, their sagas still echo, and their story continues to captivate the world. For the Vikings were more than raiders of the North, they were dreamers, builders, and explorers. A people who proved that the horizon was never an end, only a beginning. The Vikings' legacy lives on, in our stories, in our languages, and in the restless fire that drives us still to seek, to conquer, to dream.